friends. I'm Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center, and welcome to We the People, a weekly show of constitutional debate. The National Constitution Center is a nonpartisan nonprofit chartered by Congress to increase awareness and understanding of the Constitution among the American people. In this episode, I am honored to welcome the great Walter Isaacson to discuss his new book, The Greatest Sentence Ever Written. Walter is the best-selling author of many award-winning biographies, including Musk, Da Vinci, Einstein, and Franklin. He's a professor of history at Tulane, and he's long been a hero of mine. In this book, he's distilled the essence of the Declaration word by word, focusing on the second sentence, which is the very foundation of the American Creed. Walter, it is so wonderful to welcome you to We the People.
It's great to be back with you, Jeff, and to see you again, and the National Constitution Center, one of my beloved places.
That is great. Well, you've made this conversation easy by organizing the book so well, and you go word by word. So let's start where you do, at the beginning, and the word we.
You know, the second sentence was written by Jefferson, then edited by John Adams and Ben Franklin. And each word had a very specific meaning. There were about 60 people at the Continental Congress then, but we doesn't refer to those 60 people. Both Jefferson and Franklin had spent a lot of time reading John Locke and other Enlightenment thinkers in Europe who had created the contract theory of government, meaning Rousseau, Locke, Hobbes, others. And the notion that we were once without government, we were once in a state of anarchy, Hobbes called it nasty, brutish, and short, and that we came together to form a social contract. That's what they mean by we. And so I start the book by just exploring a little bit that notion of social contract theory. It used to be that when you had a declaration or a constitution, it was for the divine right of kings or some power of the conqueror. But this was something totally new. It was we hold these truths. And that same word is engraved in your building because it's the first word 11 years later when they write the Constitution. They say, we the people.
You put it so well, and by citing Hume and Locke and Rousseau, give us the essence of social contract theory. And yet those theorists didn't use the word we. They were talking about the individual in the social contract. How was it that the word we ended up in the Declaration?
That's an important question because social contract theory and, of course, the United States depends on individuals and the individual rights. But according to Hobbes, Rousseau, Hume, and especially John Locke, whose second treatise on government was the thing that Jefferson and Franklin read so often, you give up some of the individuality when you decide, in order to emerge from a state of nature, in order to have a more civilized society, you voluntarily, as an individual, give up the right to do certain things, and then to make a contract or compact based on that right. So that's how you got from individual rights to what I would call collective rights, what we have as our collective shared rights.
And by showing that the centrality of that word, both to the Declaration and the Constitution, you show us the relationship between those two documents. Well, our next word is self-evident.
You know, when Jefferson wrote the first draft, he writes, we hold these truths to be sacred. You go, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. And if you look at the first draft, which is in the Library of Congress, I wish they'd display it more. That first draft is the flyleaf of my book. You can see Benjamin Franklin, as a printer, used to use heavy backslashes. He had this big black pen like editors do, and he backslashed the word sacred out, and he wrote in self-evident. And his point was that our rights come from reason and rationality, not from the dictates or dogma of a religion. And he had been very close friends with David Hume, who we mentioned, Scottish philosopher, probably the greatest English-speaking philosopher of that time, the 1770s. And Ben Franklin had been staying with him in Scotland. And Hume had just come up with a theory that involves self-evident truths. We hear the phrase self-evident, we think, oh, that's just a fancy way to say obvious. No, for Hume, there were two types of truths. One were synthetic truths that you have to have evidence to see if they're right or not, such as Philadelphia is larger than New York. The other are truths by reason or definition, like all bachelors are unmarried. If you got to figure out the truth of the sentence, Philadelphia is bigger than New York, you got to go check out, see how many people live in each city, compare the two. But you don't have to do a survey of all bachelors and say, do you have a wife or not, in order to know that all bachelors are unmarried. That was the self-evident truth. And the reason it's important for this sentence is when they start talking about all men are created equal. Well, no, if you go walking around the streets of Philadelphia and you ask people, what talents they have, there are going to be some that have bigger or smarter or better basketball players, whatever they are. People are not equal in that regard, but they're equal in the contract and being part of the contract that creates the we, that brings us together, because we were all totally autonomous individuals, come together, make that contract. And so in terms of our political rights, we're equal. And that's what they meant by self-evident.
Your emphasis on Hume's distinction between synthetic and analytical truths is so clarifying. And as you say, Hume distinguished between truths contingent on empirical evidence, that's synthetic, and those true by reason and definition, that's analytic.
I'm a big lover of David Hume. I hate to go way back, but when I did my graduate degree, I spent some time on John Locke, but I fell in love with David Hume. And, he was there, 1770s. He's got Franklin as a house guest. And he's telling Franklin, my cook makes the best sheep's head soup in all of Europe. And so he's a wonderful guy. And I like to try to bring out the personalities as we look at who wrote this sentence and what it meant.
You really do. And we imagine Hume and Franklin sitting around the soup and talking. But I was always struck by the fact that Hume is quoted more often than any other philosopher at the convention. People seem to know him by heart. But James Madison at the Constitutional Convention focuses on the part of Hume that talks about the formation of opinion. And Hume, like Milton, thinks that opinion is formed by a clash between truth and error with reason free to combat it. But what your distinction is so interesting is there's a difference between truth that we discover by opinion and that's either self-evident or factual and can be witnessed. Can you help me take another beat on that?
Yeah, I did not know Hume was the most cited at the Constitutional Convention. I'm glad to learn that because, as you can tell, I'm a David Hume fanboy. But yes, the notion that this type of truth is self-evident is kind of at the core of what they were trying to do. David Hume spends a lot of time saying that the clash of opinion, if people argue different sides, that eventually truth will win out over falsity. That's something that a lot of people, John Stuart Mill says it, Brandeis, as you know quite well, you've written all about Brandeis and Oliver Wendell Holmes. They all think in the marketplace of ideas, truth is going to win out. That is not necessarily true, as we're learning today on the internet. And I think Hume believed it was true, but he did believe there was a higher order of truth, which were things you couldn't even argue about. That it's not like let's have both sides on the question of whether all bachelors are unmarried, or frankly, both sides on the question of all people should have equal political rights.
I got to take another beat on this with you because I'm so eager for your thoughts. This question of whether truth will actually emerge from falsehood, as you say, is not true on the internet. In the 20th century, Walter Lippmann thinks that movies will distort the truth because people will get pictures in their heads that don't correspond to the truth. Hannah Arendt thinks that dictators will put propaganda and fake news that will distort the truth. And now, as you suggest, we also have AI coming up. Might technology be a remedy that would help people see the factual truths that Hume emphasized by looking at the actual empirical evidence, or present differing points of view that could allow people to consider them before making up their own minds? What are your thoughts about the future of technology and truth?
Well, the question is, of course, whether artificial intelligence will be truth-seeking or whether it will reflect our biases. And, there are a lot of people pushing to have it be rigidly truth-seeking, but among those people pushing for that are Elon Musk. And some people might say, wait a minute, what's true for Elon Musk ain't true for me. And so it's going to be a battle when it comes to technology that way. Benjamin Franklin was in the category of David Hume you talked about. He has a wonderful essay called Apology for Printers, in which he talks about printing all sides in the Pennsylvania Gazette. And he says, when truth and falsity have fair play, truth will always win out. Now, as we say, I'm just not sure that's totally true in the modern age. And there's another Franklin saying, which is in Poor Richard's Almanac, which is that a lie can make it halfway around the globe while the truth is still putting on its shoes. And that's particularly true with the internet or AI or social media, because things spread so quickly. I think one of the challenges of our time is creating sources of information, media, AIs, in which it doesn't reflect the weird conspiracy theories that get amplified on social media, but instead reflects a consensus of people who are sincerely trying to get at the truth. And I think that's where one starts, is we sometimes know that people aren't purely motivated when they're making some arguments. They're not trying to get to the truth. And I think getting back to that type of discussion that they had in the Continental Congress when they're writing the Declaration, which is, let's have a civil discourse here. That'll get us closer to the truth. It's what you do at the Constitution Center.
Well, it's what you've done in all your work as well. And we're thinking at the Constitution Center of creating a kind of Madison tool for AI that would encourage that kind of civil discourse, that would present the consensus of people sincerely trying to get at the truth, and present people with differing points of view and encourage them to read deeply before making up their own minds.
That's fascinating. Explain to me, what's the Madison tool? It's an AI chatbot? Or
Yeah, we're just beginning to discuss it, which is why I'm love to brainstorm it with you. But the idea would be that rather than providing answers, the Madison tool provided further questions rooted in primary sources, making clear what the different positions were and encouraging people to read the primary sources before moving on and making up their own mind. In some ways, just as Madison hoped that the printing press would allow a class of journalists called the literati to encourage people to engage deeply with texts, you could have a Madison tool in your home that would try to do just that.
And it does tie in with the age-old concept of the common ground that Franklin did, which is the library, that he does that in Philadelphia. He decides that if we're going to have everybody be part of the political discussion, we have to make sure that every citizen has the opportunity to learn as much as the most aristocratic elite person in England. And so he creates the Library Company of Philadelphia. And when the Library of Congress comes along and opens it up to everybody, James Treslow Adams, it's about 100 years ago, he creates the phrase, the American dream. And he uses the library reading room as the foundation of the dream. So that's a little bit, Madison there is, of course, at the Library of Congress, his big bust is there. So, that's, of course, what you're trying to create almost, which is a source of reliable information that's part of our common ground.
That's exactly right. And it was so moving to read in your book that quotation from James Treslow Adams, the grandeur of the Library of Congress reading room. And as you quote him, As one looks down on the general reading room, which alone contains 10,000 volumes, which may be read without even the asking, one sees the seats filled with silent readers, old and young, rich and poor, black and white, the executive and the laborer, the general and the private. I won't read the rest of it, but that's the ideal, and the idea of a republic of readers constituting the American dream. How did that resonate at the time, and have others picked up on that dream?
It's not just readers, although those of us who write books like to think it is. It's people with open minds who are going to explore the facts before they do opinions. That's what you do when you go to the library. You look at other people's facts and opinions. As Moynihan said, we're all entitled to our opinions, but we shouldn't have our own different set of facts. And so we have to regain that notion of the common ground of facts. And we have to, like our founders, Jefferson and Franklin, and to some extent Madison, they were scientists. So they also knew that scientific method of, if you're going to have a theory, before you cling to it, test it out, get some evidence, be able to revise your theories when you have new evidence. So that open-mindedness is sort of the deeper foundation of just being a reader. You're a reader with an open mind.
What a beautiful idea of a community of people of open minds could create a common ground. Madison is indeed the model for the open-minded citizen, and there's a great biography I just read which notes that the day he died, he's sitting at Montpelier, he stirs slightly, his daughter asks what's wrong, and he says, "Nothing, my dear, just a change of mind," and then he dies.
Let me interject something there, which I'm sure we're going to get to in this talk. Madison, Jefferson, all those people in Monticello and Montpelier, they were enslavers too, and they really did wrestle with that, but it didn't get them, even at the end of their lives, to the truth. So these are great people with open minds, but we're still trying to perfect the project they left to us.
We are indeed, and you bring out that challenge so powerfully in your parsing of the next two words, all men.
Well, when you say all men, that sounds pretty expansive, like all men. And to some extent, we sometimes think that phrase refers to all humanity. When we talk about the rights of man or something, we use man in a more gender neutral way. And so I went and looked and thought about, is that what they meant? All men, to mean all humanity. But no, they had debates over, does it include women? As you know, famously, Abigail Adams is writing to John, don't forget the women. Don't make this a patriarchy where you take away our rights. And he says, we're not going to give up our masculine rights. And so they're debating women. And then, of course, slavery is the big issue there. So all men and then created equal, that is something that they know they haven't conquered. Jefferson in particular is agonized about it. He, even in his first draft of the Declaration, he's decrying the slave trade, but also enslaving more than 400 people. Throughout his life, he says slavery is abhorrent, and yet he doesn't free his slaves. So we watch Jefferson wrestle with it. I tend to, of course, like Franklin better, because Franklin's personal arc of history mirrors the American arc of history, which is when he was young, Franklin owned 2 or 3 slaves in his print shop in Philadelphia. But after a while, they kind of wandered off. They were, King was one of his names and another. He doesn't pursue them. He no longer enslaves people. But he realizes he had committed a really bad moral error by having permitted slavery and the advertising of slavery in his newspaper. You have to remember, all 13 colonies in 1776 had slavery and made it legal. So Franklin becomes the president of the Society for the Abolition of Slavery as an old man. I was around 80, which back then was considered old. I know we think that's young these days in our leaders, but Franklin becomes president of the Society for the Abolition of Slavery because he's trying to rectify his mistakes. That moral arc of Franklin, having gotten it wrong, but trying to push it, figure out getting it right, that's part of the moral arc of American history. And fourscore and 7 years after they do the document, famously, Abraham Lincoln at the cemetery at Gettysburg is referring to this second sentence. The very beginning says, fourscore and 7 years ago, a new type of nation conceived in the notion that all men are created equal. So we can see this sentence not be correct when it's written, but push us over the years, including those buried in the Gettysburg Cemetery, to see if we can get the meaning of this sentence and turn it into our true creed.
You so powerfully distill Franklin's evolution in your book and remind us how other founders like John and Abigail Adams expressly disapproved of slavery. You quote Abigail in particular as saying that Southern slaveholders' delegates' pretension to liberty are mockery when they held hundreds in chains. You note John Locke, who also justified slavery, and yet, as you say, the word provided a beacon for others to
and do
demand their
remember
place
when
later.
Abigail Adams is great, and John Adams agrees with her, but he says, yes, but we can't touch it. It's too hot of an issue right now. And he doesn't force the abolition of slavery either at the Declaration or at the Constitution or when he becomes president. He won't tackle that issue.
And did Franklin, in tackling it, press it further than Adams and kind of respectable Northern opinion was willing to go?
Yes, he presented, I think at age 82, a petition to the Congress saying that you have to, for the abolition of slavery, total abolition of slavery, which obviously they weren't ready to go to. Not even John Adams is supporting it. And one of the Southern representatives gets up and says, well, the Bible justifies it, and how are we going to have our crops, and we're Christianizing these slaves. The last parody that Ben Franklin writes, he always wrote parodies, starting when he's like 15 years old and writing Silence Do Good essays for his brother's paper, is a parody, which is a speech given by the Divan in the Divan of Algiers, with the leader saying we have to keep enslaving white Christian Europeans because, and he repeats the same arguments, but it's Franklin's way of parodying that. And yes, his petition to Congress to abolish slavery doesn't even get a vote. They didn't even bring it up for a vote.
And right away, African American and white people are invoking Jefferson's language to rebuke his hypocrisies. Prince Hall in 1777, Gouverneur Morris at the Constitutional Convention. Was this created equal language immediately a galvanizing force for reform?
Well, they knew it was a push because Jefferson, as I describe in the book, it takes the phrase from the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which had been passed 1 month earlier in June of 1776. And of course, being Virginia, and George Mason, his friend, is the main author, is an enslaver, they try to hedge it. They say all men are created equal when they enter into a political society. And that phrase was specifically there to eliminate slaves from the sentence. In other words, they weren't a part of it because they had not entered, according to the Virginians, into society. And so they knew that sentence was fraught. And that was the original way that George Mason wrote it, was the way Jefferson did, that, all men are created equal. And they put an amendment in so that they can exclude slaves from that category in the Virginia House of Delegates. So it's not as if they didn't understand the dangerous power or wonderful power of that phrase.
Is there something about the final language, created equal rather than created equally free and independent, that had broader anti-slavery implications than previous social contract theorists had imagined?
Yeah, created equally free and independent, and that's the way I think they do it in the Virginia Declaration too, and it's in the original draft of Jefferson. And that was, in a way, not quite going as far. It just said they were independent, but still, if you put slaves in that category, then they should be free and independent. And they strike that out. I think that was part of the reason was Jefferson's discomfort. I mean, picture this. You're in Philadelphia right now, right? There, and and you can picture Market Street. There's a room on Market Street right near Independence Hall, and Jefferson's on the mahogany desk he brings from Monticello, writing this. And Franklin said, "And who's next to Jefferson? A guy named Hemings, who was Sally Hemings's brother, a slave of Ben Franklin, and he's standing there while they're writing it. He's his slave valet." And so, we should celebrate the founders, but we should also just get our minds around the complexities that they bequeathed to us.
So powerful, amazing that Hemings was right there. What was Jefferson thinking when he so self-righteously denounced the international slave trade in that section that was cut out? He became much less opposed to slavery over the course of his life. But George Mason himself also was a fiery opponent of the international slave trade. And it was only South Carolina and Georgia that wanted to preserve it. My question is, how could these Virginians, Mason and Jefferson, be so indignant about the international slave trade, even as they had slaves?
Well, I'll give you the more crass, not elevated answer, which is in their economic interest. They own huge amounts of slaves, and slaves are, populating and growing. And to the extent that the other colonies are importing more slaves as opposed to buying them from Virginian plantation owners, it's reducing the value of what they consider their property. And so the Virginians could somehow get their minds around being okay with slavery, but wanting to stop the trade in slavery because it undermined they made money by selling slaves, and slaves, being bred on their plantations. And it was one of the truly gruesome parts of slavery is this was a money-making enterprise. Now, you can give a maybe more charitable towards Jefferson and the Virginians explanation too, which is they realized slavery was bad, but they weren't willing to give it up. And if you're going to have some motion towards abolishing slavery eventually, you have to start by abolishing the trade in slavery. But I don't think they ever proposed that Virginians not be allowed to sell their slaves down the river to New Orleans for cash money.
That seems exactly right. The more charitable answer, they knew it was bad and wrong. They liked the lifestyle and didn't want to give it up, but thought it would eventually die out on its own, and therefore were willing to stop the slave trade.
They actually did believe it would die out. And those of us who love the history of technology know that sometimes weird things happen, like the cotton gin and other things, which suddenly takes what was a not very economic practice, which was enslaving people. It becomes more economic when you have the technology and the boom in textiles. So we're sometimes driven by economics, believe it or not, Jeffrey.
Well, you've shown that so powerfully. And what do you make of the fact that these men knew it was wicked and wrong, but liked the lifestyle and didn't want to give it up and made a wrong bet about technology? Are there similar compromises and hypocrisies we're making today?
Absolutely. I mean, you ever know any people like that who know something's wrong, but I'm still in favor of this particular leader because I need to help my carried interest or my, taxation or stuff. Yeah. I mean, one of the things we have to hark back to is this notion of common ground in which is not simply about your own interests. It's what makes a better community, what makes a better country. And look, they shed a lot of blood. I mean, I was just watching the Ken Burns. It was brutal, the revolution. So they made the ultimate sacrifice. And, we have to live up to that. It's a good question when you say, or what you say, are we still doing that? And I say, yeah, do you ever know anybody like that who says, I think this is a bad thing, but it's in my economic interest, so I'm not going to challenge it? I ask my students here at Tulane, I say, okay, if you're that much in favor of taking down Thomas Jefferson's statue, let's say, I get it. But suppose you give some money to Tulane, they hang your picture on the wall. What are they going to say a century from now, or even 50 years from now, about you, Harry Smith, Tulane student? What did you do that a century from now we may find abhorrent? So one of the things we should do is add a bit of humility into our judgment of the founders.
So true. You talk about how humility was the hardest virtue for Franklin to achieve, but he came closer to it and called for humility at the end of the Constitutional Convention. How can we cultivate that humility?
I think our algorithms, our talk radio, our cable TV, they all thrive on strong judgments as opposed to people testing their theories, revising them, and having some humility. It's almost inbred into the technology that the most cocksure person's going to get the most clicks type of thing, and the most amplification by the algorithms on X or Instagram. I have my own personal trick, which I kind of learned from Ben Franklin when he writes about trying to acquire the virtue of humility. And he says, it's beautiful in his letters. He says, I was never very good at the virtue of humility, but I was good at the pretense of humility. I could fake it very well. He said, and then I learned that the pretense of humility is just as useful as the reality because it made you question whether you were wrong, whether the person next to you was right. And that was the essence, he said, of the middle class democracy we're trying to do. So he kept a ledger. Now that sounds really trite and stuff, but I do that, both a mental ledger and look, when I don't, but I have it right here, a notebook I keep, and I try to jot down the things large and small that I turned out to be wrong about, and then how I rectified it, because he kept that notebook. And it was on big things like slavery, and he tries to rectify it by his leadership of the Society for the Abolition. Little things like running away from being an indentured servant to his brother. He rectifies it by educating his brother's child when his brother dies. And in my notebook, I'll say, okay, I was wrong when I asserted this. But even big things like I was in favor of free trade, globalization, just like everybody you knew was, in the 90s. We thought that free trade, free movements of people, a global economy was going to create great wealth. And as I say in the book, that was right. It created a lot of wealth, but it left a lot of people behind. And the wealth was distributed not only unequally, but it hollowed out a middle class that used to believe America was a land of opportunity. I hated the idea of tariffs, made fun of them and all. And you know what? I think I was wrong. I think my embrace of free trade and free movements of people and lots of immigration, all are worthy. But when it went too far, it just meant that jobs got outshored. Immigrants, took lower paying jobs and did things that kept wages down. And the person in Keokuk, Iowa, who maybe they could go to Walmart on a Sunday night and get a really cheap flat screen TV, but they couldn't get up in the morning and take the bus to the factory where they used to have a job at the Maytag plant or the Whirlpool plant. So I've tried to think of all the things that I got wrong. And who knows, 10 years from now, I'll say, hey, I was wrong saying I was wrong. Free trade was actually much better than I thought. I want to keep my mind open the way Madison and Ben Franklin did.
That's remarkable. I knew about Franklin's chart of daily virtues, but I didn't know about his book of errors.
Yeah, he called them errata. It's a beautiful ledger. the errata and how he rectified them. What I was wrong about, and you know quite well that speech he gives at the end of the Constitutional Convention, which is basically, I'm not sure there's a perfect Constitution, but it may be the most perfect humans could do. And look around this room and consider that the people arguing with you may turn out to be right, and you may turn out to be wrong. And he talks about how, religious disputes and everything, he makes fun of them. And he says, we're too cocksure. Let's have some humility. We might have been wrong on some things.
Extraordinary. And it was your book of errata that led you to embrace the idea of the common ground as opposed to pure free trade?
Well, I don't, and that's elevating it a bit too much. It would be good for the story if so. I'm here in Louisiana. Spend a lot of time in places like Bogalusa that used to have wonderful factories. I used to think it's silly to do manufacturing in America. It's better to offshore it. But when I see the fact, here's an astonishing fact in my book that turned me around about 2 years ago when I saw it. If you were born when I was in the 1950s, you had an 80% chance of being financially better off than your parents. And if you were born in the past 30 years, you have less than a 50% chance. Think of what that means if you have less than a 50% chance of doing as well as your parents. I mean, less than half. And so, yes, we have a populist revolt. But why did that happen? Well, because people like me and the meritocratic elite said, oh, everybody should go to college, and if you don't go, it's your fault, and we're going to offshore jobs and make a knowledge economy and build a bridge to the future, or God knows what we were all saying. Well, that really hollowed out America and made it so we lost the American dream. And that's what the end of this book is about, which is you gotta make sure we keep the American dream, which is fundamentally the American dream is it's a land of opportunity for all, and especially the belief that your kids are even going to be better off than you were. And that is not true today. So that turned me around over the past 5 or 6 years. And we got so partisan that, Donald Trump would suggest tariffs. And so anybody who hates Donald Trump now thinks that tariffs are the root of all evil. And I'm trying to keep an open mind. I'm, reading Orrin Cass, other people, J.D. Vance even, which is, okay, maybe we embrace free trade and free movement of people and free immigration in ways that were economically good for GDP, but were really bad for the opportunities for a middle class.
Remarkable. We will dig in more to your vision of how we could continue to pursue that American dream, but we have a few more words to get through first. And the next one is endowed by their creator.
It's interesting because everybody says we're a Christian nation, a Christian. Well, no. Jefferson was a deist, which basically meant that he thought, well, there's probably some creator, but not a personal God that you could pray to, and God would be intervening in our lives. And you'd say, okay, let me make sure that, Philadelphia wins the game tonight or something if you pray hard enough. And he did not believe in the divinity of Jesus. He made the Bible, which is still there in Monticello, by taking a razor and cutting out all the parts of the Bible that talk about the miracles of Jesus. And it just leaves in Jesus's moral teaching. So he is really unconventional. Franklin, too, on his deathbed, said, I asked about, did he believe in the divinity of Christ? He says, well, I don't try to preach on it because I've never felt I was an expert on it. And now I don't worry about it because I'm going to learn about it soon enough, because he was on his deathbed. And he's like, okay, I'll soon find out. But these people were not conventionally religious the way some people try to embrace them. And yet Adams adds in that phrase, by their creator. And Adams is a little bit more conventional in his religious outlook, although he was a Unitarian, which is a form of deism. But I think that they felt that appealing to sort of a divine providence, not an interventionist God who is sending hell and brimstone and sinners in the hands of an angry God type God, but just a benevolent creator added to the humility and to an understanding of how blessed and how graced we were. They don't really refer to God much in the Declaration. A deist belief is that it's sort of nature's laws, and they refer to the laws of nature and of nature's God, which is the way they put it. So I think endowed by their creator was just a sense of being awed at the beauty and the greatness of creation and of the deity that helped create us.
It's so moving to see Jefferson and Adams talking about comparative religion when they were old, noting the connections between the Bhagavad Gita and the Dhammapada, Adams summing up his faith as love God and all his creatures. No question that they were people who believed in God, but as you suggest, it was not the Trinity of Jesus and a more deist belief. And you note that Jefferson's first version of the phrase was from that equal creation they derive rights. How significant was it that the committee tweaked his language to endowed by their creator?
I think it was their way of doing a balance. They had struck out sacred, which, we hold these truths to be sacred. They put in David Hume's favorite phrase, self-evident. But then they're trying to balance it. And you can see, if you look at the flyleaf of the book or you look at the original document, it says, it doesn't say they're endowed by the creator. That's written on top of the lines. I think it's John Adams who does it. We're not absolutely sure. So I think it's really them getting this notion of balance where they want to pay homage to the grace we should feel, the grace that's been bestowed upon us, while also saying we have to figure out our rights coming from reason and self-evident truths.
That's the crucial insight, and that puts it so well. We have to realize that our rights come from reason, and that's compatible with religion. And the great division at the Constitutional Convention wasn't God or no God, it was theists, those Puritan theocrats who wanted to have established religions, and the religion of reason people like Madison and Jefferson who thought people had to make up their own minds, and you capture all that in your discussion.
It helps that they were in Philadelphia, which is a place that has not only Quakers and Unitarians and obviously Presbyterians and but Catholics and Jews, and Benjamin Franklin's donating to the building fund of the Congregation Mikveh Israel. So you have a diverse community there compared to Boston.
That was so moving to learn of Franklin's donation to Mikveh Israel, which of course still exists. Anything more on the founders and the Jews? Jonah Phillips is petitioning for religious freedom. How did the Jews do?
Well, you certainly know Washington's letter is it Providence
yes.
Synagogue, and they're very careful about doing something that's really unusual in this world in 1776, which is having it be a diverse group of different religions, different ethnic origins, all getting equal rights eventually. And, they don't do it with slaves, don't quite do it with women, but this notion that you have not just religious tolerance, but a religious respect. The other thing Franklin did, if you imagine yourself looking at Independence Hall and you look to your left, there's that building still called the New Hall. When Franklin writes a fundraising document for it, it's there to be a pulpit for visiting preachers of the Great Awakening. And he writes, even if the Mufti of Constantinople were to send somebody here to teach Mohammedism to us and teach us about the prophet, we should offer a pulpit and we should listen and learn. So that notion of one historian, I won't say the name, he's long dead, but said all they gave to us was this, notion of a good-natured religious tolerance. I said, what do you mean that's all they gave to us? That is the most amazing breakthrough. I mean, in Europe, there was still fighting, the 100 Years' War, the wars of religion and everything else. And we were saying, no, everybody can belong. And of course, I have to keep caveating it. They didn't mean everybody, but eventually they set it in motion with that sentence that, and we're still trying to live up to that sentence by making sure everybody has equal rights.
Beautifully put. Certain unalienable rights.
Yeah, the only thing interesting about that to me is I think Jefferson writes unalienable. No, I think he writes inalienable. And it's almost like a typo because nobody can read his handwriting, whatever. And eventually, when they get to the final draft, it says unalienable right. So I spent far too much time trying to figure out what's the difference between unalienable and inalienable. And there really is no difference. It simply means you can't take those rights away. You can't even give up those rights. That you enter from a state of nature, you enter into a common society, but there's certain rights you don't give up, like to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I think it was important for them to say we can't even have a government where Locke has it sometimes. If you win a war of conquest, people can give up their rights. When they're saying, no, these rights are inalienable. And that was in the Virginia earlier Declaration of Rights that George Mason does, which is rights inherent, meaning they're just part of who you are.
So true. And as you say, the difference is technical. Figuring out the technical definition is tough. It helped me when I read the definition of Francis Hutcheson, who said an inalienable right is something either that you have no power to surrender to government or that wouldn't serve any interest. And the quintessential example is freedom of thought or conscience. I can't give you the power to control my thoughts because they're the product of my reason and I have to exercise them myself.
That's fascinating. I didn't know that. That does explain it well. And, that's what I want this book to do, which is instead of just reciting this sentence by rote, think about what each of those words means, even the complicated words like inalienable. Like, all right, let's figure out what they were talking about.
Well, look what a great success you've had in provoking us to dig in deep. And it was such a brilliant idea to go word by word. And we just have one phrase left, and that is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
And as I said a little bit earlier, the earlier, I won't say versions of the sentence, but the way John Locke has it in the Second Treatise, the way George Mason has it in the Virginia Bill of Rights, more clunked up. It's about life, property, estate, that you have the rights to these. And I tend to think that Jefferson was trying to be just write better, a more felicitous phrase, and throwing in, properties and estates and other things, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I mean, you don't get much better in terms of scanning and, a beautiful phrase. But I also think, and I was discussing this with my Tulane students, they asked me about it. He said, maybe what they were doing too is using phrases that could grow with the country, that weren't that specific, that if they tried to specify instead of, rights of property and ownership of land and this, that, and the other, it was by using the phrase pursuit of happiness, it gives us our mission statement. It says, here's our creed, but it leaves it open enough that each new generation can understand what liberty means. Does it mean can't wiretap my phone? What does the pursuit of happiness mean? I interpret it to mean the American dream, that we each have an opportunity, not just to make money, but to lead a satisfied life, a useful life. That was Ben Franklin's definition of it. He said and that was James Truslow Adams who wrote the phrase that you quoted about the epic of the American dream, which is, and Franklin said it's not just a dream of riches and wealth. It's not just creating a new aristocracy of merit. It's letting each person rise to the best of their desires and abilities to serve their nation, serve their community, and serve their family. And so that was his definition of the pursuit of happiness. And the fact that they left it with this beautiful but not very specific phrase means that that phrase can grow with us as our economy changes, as our lives change, as our technologies change. But we all know each individual should be able to define for his or herself, what is my path in life? What is my pursuit of happiness?
So beautifully put, so powerful to quote Franklin's definition of not just dreams of riches and welfare, but rising to the best of your ability to serve your nation, community, and family. And that captures the fact that it's not just about immediate gratification and hedonism and materialism, but about being good, not just feeling good, the pursuit of virtue, not just the pursuit of immediate pleasure. The challenge is that we've lost that sense of an obligation to serve the nation and the community and to get outside of yourself. And with the culture shift that now defines happiness as feeling good, not being good, there's less focus on the common good. So that leads to the second part of your really important book, which is the urgent need to focus on the common good. How can we do that in an age when often happiness is defined as self-gratification rather than thinking of others?
Yeah, I ask a question at the end of the book, which is, what is an economy for? We never really ask that. We think, okay, it's to create wealth. It's to create growth. Well, no, I think an economy has a deeper purpose, which is to create a good society, to create a society of opportunity, one in which we can all work together and respect each other. So if you have an economy that maybe creates a lot of wealth, but leaves half the people behind and they're not able to live up to their potential, then you've undermined the common ground. You've let the social fabric fray. And so you have to think, what are we designing our economy to do? And to me, it's to make a good, strong nation and a good, strong people where everybody can flourish and pursue, the pursuit of happiness. And part of that is the common ground. As you said at the beginning, the concept of individual rights is at the heart of the Declaration and is at the heart of especially the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. That we were all individuals, we came together and formed a government, but we retained certain individual rights. But in doing so, we had the concept of the commons as well. John Locke writes about private property. He really believes, as I do, that private property is important to your liberty, but also to a growing economy. And so he says that people have the right to combine their labor with things that they find. And then if they make something good of it, they own it. It's private property. They deserve to benefit from that. But he has a famous clause called Locke's proviso, in which he says, as long as there's good enough left in common, as long as there's enough and is good left in common. And part of that is what they did in feudal England. You were allowed to have great estates of land, but there was something called the commons. And that's where the commoners, and that's where the word commoners comes from, the people who didn't own land got to graze their herds or plant their seeds in what was called the commons. And it was a real physical place. And when I went up to Boston and Cambridge for college, I saw Boston Common and Cambridge Common, and I didn't think much of it. No, that was the common ground where everybody had the right to, not only graze their herds, but even be buried. Common burial ground was part of it. And that led Benjamin Franklin, Cotton Mather, and many others to think, what is the common? It's not just a piece of land, but it's certain services, certain goods that we decide should be shared and be our common ground. Obviously, Franklin believed education should be it. We should have public, so he creates the Academy for the Education of Youth. And so we as a nation have put K through 12 education in the commons. Likewise, police protection. He starts a police corps, fire corps. They argue, should the fire corps only protect the houses of people who contribute money to it? He says, no, it should be in commons because we don't want, half the homes to burn down and the other half not to. Makes no sense. Our debates today is how much should be put in the commons. Even when we shut down the government, it's, well, how much healthcare should be part of the commons versus how much should be you privately responsible for. I think when you frame it that way, it makes our debates a little bit less existential and hair on fire. And say, as I said early in the show, you have to balance what you're going to put in the commons. A problem we're having now is that we're taking things out of the commons too. Michael Sandel, the philosopher who you've worked with, is one of my heroes. But he talks about what he calls skyboxification, that, when he and I go to Fenway Park when we were young, we'd all go through the same entrance. We'd all sit in the same grandstand. We'd all eat the same soggy hot dog. But now there's VIP entrances and skyboxes and velvet ropes and red carpets and stuff. And we've even taken some basic things out of the commons, like education, some. K through 12 education. My dad, his sister, my grandparents, they all went to the same high school as everybody in the neighborhood. It was a great public school. But nowadays, sometimes we have different school systems depending on your privilege. We have different, a variety of things. So I think we have to understand our debate as a nation is a good civil discourse we can have of how much should we keep in the commons. And I make an argument, it's not just generosity when you put education in the commons. You put K through 12 education. Or as Lincoln and others did, put community colleges, which used to be in the commons, and now in some ways they cost a lot of money. But we're not doing it just out of kindness and generosity, although that's a good reason to do it. We're doing it for two other moral reasons and practical reasons. One is same reason they had the commons you could graze your sheep on in feudal England. It makes people feel they have stake in the security of society. They have a stake in society surviving, as opposed to let's just burn it all down because we've got nothing at stake here. And secondly, it provides the foundation for being a land of opportunity, that if indeed you know that there's certain basic things that your kids are going to get, which is good schools, safe streets, maybe a safe place to live, that makes it possible for them to then succeed in life and have opportunity. And I think by reading this sentence that we're all dedicated to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and we say, well, part of that is having common grounds, common values, common services, common entrances to things. And we're doing it not just because we're bleeding heart generosity freaks. We're doing it because we want everybody to have some stake in the survival of our society, and we want everybody to believe their kids have an opportunity.
So beautifully put. I'm going to ask you just for the last word to sum up the point that you make at the end of the book. Is the way to achieve this spirit of being devoted to the common ground is to be more like Ben Franklin. How can Ben Franklin inspire us to converge on the common ground?
Ben Franklin, when he was a young tradesman in Philadelphia, started a leather apron club, which was what he was called for we the middling people. It wasn't the aristocracy there. It wasn't a union of workers. It was shopkeepers and artisans, he said. And we're going to have middle-class values. And that leather apron club, which he called the Junto sometimes, did these common ground things. It started the street sweeping corps. It started the volunteer fire department, the militia, the hospital, a widows and orphans fund, sort of like Social Security, the schools. And by saying, all right, being successful, I have to know how I can make our community better, more cohesive. That was what they were doing back then, and we need to regain. Because if we're going to repair this nation, I think it's going to be from the ground up. I mean, I moved back to my hometown in New Orleans and said, okay, we're not doing this nationally, but maybe if each town figures out how to figure out its problem. And then secondly, Benjamin Franklin believed not only in education, but in private enterprise. He creates revolving loan funds for people who had been like himself, indentured servants or runaway apprentices, so that they can start their own businesses. And those loan funds, he said, that people will pay back the loans, it'll last for at least a century. Well, it's been 250 years almost. You still have one in Philadelphia. There's still one in Boston that's using the Benjamin Franklin revolving loan fund. So that's creating the land of opportunity. And finally, as I said to you, he donated to the building fund of each and every church built in Philadelphia. And that new hall we talked about for visiting preachers, including ones preaching Islam. And on his deathbed, he does the congregation Mikveh Israel. So when he dies, instead of his minister accompanying his casket to the grave, all 35 ministers, preachers, and priests linked arms with the rabbi of the Jews and marched with him to that grave that's really outside your window at the National Constitution Center. You can see his grave there. That's what they were fighting for back then. That's what that sentence meant to them. And that's what we still have to dedicate ourselves to on our 250th birthday, to say, yes, for all of our disputes, let's celebrate the glory of what this country has been and could be even better.
Walter Isaacson, for inspiring all of us to live up to the example of Benjamin Franklin and to live every word of the greatest sentence ever written. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you, Jeffrey.
This episode was produced by Bill Pollack and Griffin Ritchie. It was engineered by Bill Pollack. Research was provided by Griffin Ritchie, Anna Salvatore, Trey Sullivan, and Tristan Worsham. I'm thrilled that my new book is out. It's called The Pursuit of Liberty, How Hamilton versus Jefferson Ignited the Lasting Battle Over Power in America. Please check it out at a bookstore near you. And if you'd like a signed book plate, please let me know. And always remember that the National Constitution Center is a private nonprofit. We rely on your generosity, passion, and engagement for all our programming. Please consider donating at constitutioncenter.org/donate. On behalf of the National Constitution Center, I'm Jeffrey Rosen.